Where did you hear said thing?
From a very reliable source. If you reference that, you use it as a clip in a podcast and reference in it's not. It doesn't fall under the
statute
laws
of
the
limitation.
Wow.
the laws. Of the land.
I don't know. Theologians does that all the time.
No,
So does
you can.
Wretched Radio does that a lot.
That might be true. I just wanted to hear your source. And I feel that you never gave it to us.
Well, it's kind of one of those situations where,
to yourself.
like when you have a really good news article and you're about to bust a giant mafia gang, you don't give up your source because that can put,
Yeah, this is basically that exact situation.
That's what's known in accounting as like a liability.
Oh my goodness.
That's my understanding of how that works.
So many realms mixed into one thing right now.
This is Shadowcast Radio.
Welcome back. You're listening to Shadowcast Radio with your host, Owen Brasington.
Preston Ackerman.
Nathan Brasington.
And that's the wonderful music of the Shire.
Of Ye Old Shire.
Of Ye Old Shire. We're able to podcast here from Ireland. So that's a treat.
It's a treat. Which is apparently where the Shire is.
Actually, I think the Shire was inspired by like the cottage in Birmingham.
That's probably right.
But I mean,
We'll get there.
we'll go with
there.
your.
It just seems
We'll
like
go
it
with your
should
lie.
be in Ireland.
It should be.
In Ireland.
Yeah. Yes. Which
What about-
actually is falling in line with what we are talking about today.
Ireland?
Yeah.
Well, Lewis was born in Ireland.
That's
Yeah,
true.
okay.
That's true.
So
Fair enough.
there's your connection.
Actually, this is I'm excited for this topic because it's going to be a mini series.
Yes.
And this was the idea of Preacher P. And so tell us kind of what you have in mind for this series.
Yeah, this is a dream of mine, actually. I've always wanted to talk about J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and their stories, and also the stories of their lives, and also the stories that they themselves told, their literature. I am a massive fan of both of these giants in literature, and I think God is telling a fascinating story with their lives, and then also with the gospel themes as it permeates even their literature. So this series is going to be talking about the men themselves, some of our favorite works of Lewis and Tolkien. And then also we're going to do a little bit of discussion about why the fairy tale structure, why the use of magic in their stories, and can we actually call it Christian if they use magic and invoke all these sort of magical characters and settings. So should be a good series,
I'm
I
excited.
think.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Man. Yeah, we've talked about this for a long time, actually. Just doing kind of the life of, the works of, and the use of magic in these two authors. And
did you guys like read their stories growing up? Was this something that was in your guys' household?
Some of their books, you mean?
Yeah, either their books or
absolutely.
their movies.
Yep.
I did. I don't know that Owen did, but I did.
You were the good
I'm
shit.
just kidding. No, I don't. I remember reading The Lord of the Rings actually in, I think it was junior high. And I for sure didn't fully appreciate it at that time. And then Narnia.
Was it like a required reading? Or did you just read it?
I just read them for fun. And then I think in college is when I read Narnia. And I definitely
The Chronicles.
was getting to a place where I could really appreciate that more. So.
What was your first experience with the works of these men, Owen?
Oh, I'm trying to think. I think it probably was the movies. Although I have read a lot more of C.S. Lewis's books. I really enjoyed a lot of his.
And you've done some of his nonfiction work as well, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So Paralandria was a great book. I loved that of his. And so it was kind of cool because I was getting into books like Pilgrim Progress. And so I love those.
Just Pilgrim Progress?
Yeah.
Okay, it's a good one.
He didn't write that book though.
That's a different guy.
Yeah, that was a different author.
No, but he wrote a book called Pilgrim's Digress or
Regress.
Regress. Yeah.
There you go.
The digression.
Yeah, it was the sequel. That's not true.
Okay, fake news. Don't listen
right.
to it.
But anyways, so I don't want to take a lot away from our great topic today, and so I am going to do another lightning round of questions.
I don't like that you
usually have.
limit me. I want to think about my
It's a
answers.
lightning.
So, okay, quick question. What has been the best practical advice that you can remember off the top of your head that you've
Oh
received?
my goodness.
Some real practical advice.
I'm good.
What I think of immediately off the top of my head is, it sounds very specific and silly. My dad, when he taught me to drive, he said, never trust the rear view mirrors. Always look when you're about to pass and look when you're about to switch lanes.
Okay.
That's the best I got, man.
That's the best you got.
That's all right. That's a good one. Mine, I don't even remember who said this, and maybe it's actually just a quote, but don't take yourself too seriously. And I think that's been great practical advice.
That's
Oh
good.
man, yeah, that's really good.
Yeah. Yeah. Be along certain lines with that, be willing to laugh at yourself. I think that
There
has
you go.
been a
Yeah.
pretty good one. I wouldn't say it's the best, but I just off the
Yeah.
top of my head.
Right.
How about something that's made you laugh because it may not have been directed at you, but some of the worst advice you've heard.
Oh,
Follow your heart.
Okay. There
Yeah.
you go.
so I remember distinctly in college, someone told me that sometimes you just have to get your fill of sin before you realize that you don't want it and that it's not good for you. And at the time I was like, yeah, man, okay, maybe, maybe. And then like in hindsight, I'm
virtuous.
like, that's a horrible idea. Like, that is not a good call. Anyways.
No, that's good. What about you, man? You haven't answered any of these questions.
That's a good one. Oh, man.
Lightning. Uh-oh.
Lightning round.
Lightning's
Okay,
quick.
I'm going to say that
Best practical advice.
you can do anything
Yeah.
if you put your mind to it.
Yeah, that's kind
That's the worst advice you've heard?
Lightning round, yes.
Oh, so that's the worst advice part. All right.
Yes.
Now, what's the good advice?
Oh, I said the good advice is probably. Oh man,
You said be willing to laugh at yourself,
Yeah.
right?
yeah,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
yeah. So that's
No, I'm with that, man. It's so funny to me that like that's a mantra of the American dream is you can be whatever you want to be. And I'm like, that's actually not true. Like, you know, there are limitations and certainly God can do whatever he wants with us and his plans are amazing. But I'm like, that doesn't mean you have the ability to do all things. Like,
yeah.
what in the world?
Yeah.
Yep.
Anyways.
No, it's
Sorry.
a little
I don't mean to
bloviated
crush-
advice. No, that's good.
Yeah. Okay.
Well,
I guess in this episode, we're just going to be refuting American tropes this entire episode.
I guess.
So.
We'll see.
There we go.
All right.
We'll see.
Oh, and I'm excited to see what you bring to this.
All right. Well, let's start it off with J.R.R. Tolkien. Now,
So,
let Pete. Is it Tolkien or Tolkien?
oh man, already
Starting
Because-
off, that should have been your lightning round
This
question.
will be a source of division. I think
already
over this.
proving my lack of knowledge. So that is on the Tolkien Society, they have it pronunciated as Tolkien. However, I have grown up saying it Tolkien, and I know many that have, and I know that that's a debate. And really, my thought would be, is that worth dividing over? Like,
Yes.
I think we're okay either way. But a question I had though too before we start this. So again, a 3-part series: the life of Lewis and Tolkien, the works of Lewis and Tolkien, and then the use of magic in their works, and what should a believer think about that. But P, this was your idea, and we're so on board with it. But let me ask you, like, for those that love history and are influenced by these guys, I think this will be really meaningful. But what about those that are like, I don't, maybe I haven't read those books, or maybe I saw only one of the movies or whatever. Like, why do we want to talk about this? Why does this has value?
Oh man, why does it have value? I could say a lot. I'll try to be brief in my answer. So I think both of these men have been influenced by the biblical worldview, the biblical themes of the gospel and of the scriptures. And I think they interweave those themes in their stories. And so they're not just merely for entertainment value, as it were. You don't just watch the epic so that you are merely entertained by it, though not to say that's a bad thing to be entertained by. Good storytelling, it should be entertaining.
Right.
But I think it's because they tell in a sort of micro condensed way the story of the gospel. And that's what I think is powerful about their works and why they've stood the test of time. They were very talented men who, these academics, these writers, these professors, they told the story of Christ in their stories, in these sort of micro stories. So that's why I think they're valuable. I think they have a beauty in them because they reflect the grander story that God told throughout history in the person and work of Jesus. And so I think they matter tangentially because they're related to Christ in that fashion.
Well, that's
and then obviously with Lewis, he wrote a lot of theology books as well, and sort of different, sort of not the children's fiction. He also wrote
a lot of apologetics,
and really his life. And it's interesting. We'll get into it at the end of the ep. Sort of Lewis's story. His whole life is kind of an apologetic, and
it's good.
It's really interesting, kind of
really
his
is.
Conversion story and what compelled him to Christ. So
yeah.
Anyway, I could go on. I won't belabor the point. I think these over these next 3 episodes, we'll sort of explore why these men and their stories are important.
Cool.
That's good, man.
Cool.
Yeah, I love that. They definitely, God is the great storyteller.
Yeah.
And all the themes of a great story ultimately come from God. And so these guys definitely displayed some of those themes throughout their writings.
Absolutely.
And it's cool to see how God used them as part of his story. And ultimately, he's using all of us as believers as part of his story. None of us are the main characters, but we're all part of it. And so
That's right,
man.
it is cool to see how he used them. So
yeah. So tell us a little bit about Tolkien.
oh man.
Or
So yeah, Tolkien. I'm not to your own preference. Leave that up to the listener. But so his full name is John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, and better known as J.R.R. Tolkien to us. But in his time, he was better known as just Ronald. So that's what most people knew him by. He was born January 3rd, 1892 in, I'm probably going to destroy this. I apologize. Bloemfontein, South Africa. So his dad actually, Arthur, was a bank clerk, and he had moved down from Britain to South Africa for a better promotional opportunity.
Yeah.
So he was a businessman, and so they were. Tolkien himself believed that their name came from the German. I got to share this fact because it made me laugh. But he believed their name to come from the German Tolkien, which the definition or the meaning of it is foolishly brave or stupidly clever. And so I thought that was
That's
so
awesome.
Both
that
are
was so
fitting.
funny.
Yes.
Yes. So probably of German descent. But anyway, so his dad, Arthur, moved down to South Africa, and where he was joined by his wife, Mabel Suffield. And so they got married. And so J.R.R. was actually, or Ronald, as we'll refer to him as, was born in South Africa.
Along with his brother Hilary.
Right? That's right. But man, his life was marked early on by some tragedy. And I know this is one of the interesting links between him and Lewis, but when he was only 4 years old, his father died. And after that, his mom, himself, and Hilary moved back to England. But 4 years old, 4 years old is when he died. So he, at an early age, experienced something of loss, something of death. And so I would say that later on we see even that theme shape his some of his works and his worldview. And by all means, you guys jump in. So what we've done to our listeners is we've kind of split up these gentlemen, and because there's so much to learn, and certainly we don't have exhaustive information. And so I'm sorry for all that we'll miss. But we'll each kind of highlight some things. And so you guys jump in wherever. But so one vivid memory that Ronald did have from South Africa, and Preston, I know you mentioned this as well, was he had an encounter with a large hairy spider. And that was one of his vivid memories from South Africa. I think you even knew the type of spider. What type was it?
Yeah. So from the research that I gathered, actually, so Tolkien has no memory of the incident, but he was told about it, actually. So he's a young kid.
Okay.
He's a young kid. And the lore is that a large baboon spider, which is like a tarantula, bit him. And his nurse actually would have sucked the venom out of the wound instantaneously. Otherwise, it would have killed him. And so apparently the lore is that even from this incident, subconsciously, Lewis, even with his arachnophobia, would have interwoven, spiders into his story. And and anybody who's familiar with Lord of the Rings, can
more to come on that.
Crazy,
I know, isn't that interesting?
Well, and I just encourage all of you as we kind of talk about the history. It's not just subjective, but know that a lot of these things really informed his writings later on. A lot of his experience in history. So. Like I said, his mom and his brother and him moved back to England, and they spent time. They lived mostly just above poverty level. They didn't have a whole lot. They weren't wealthy. They weren't completely impoverished, but they were not far from it. So
I can imagine the hardships, though. It's a mother with 2 sons.
Absolutely.
That time,
yes.
Holy cow!
And so they spent time between the rural hamlet of Sarehole and then also the darkly urban Birmingham. And so at this time, think of like your industrial, lot of crime and different things happening, and that was Birmingham.
So we're talking like the Bronx or Colfax.
Yeah, it was definitely a different place. So very contrasting locations.
Yeah.
So one thing that definitely was informative in the early years is in 1900, Mabel and the boys joined the Roman Catholic Church. So they were and the landscape of organized religion was a little bit different back then, obviously. But they actually went from being Protestant to Roman Catholic, and doing so estranged them from both sides of the family. And so it was that made their situation even a little more difficult, and they stayed devout Catholics until death.
Yep.
So
that incident from Lewis's childhood and his mom and then the 2 sons joining the Roman Catholic Church, he would take that same faith to his grave.
Right.
Which is kind of contrasted differently than even Lewis's story.
Yes,
and so Tolkien would have been informed really by sort of the scriptures, the biblical worldview, at least as far as Roman Catholicism, how it would have presented it. But he would have been familiar with the themes of Christ. From a young age.
Absolutely. And then in 1904, his mother, Mabel, died of diabetes. So at that time, of course, there was no insulin injections, and diabetes was mostly a death sentence.
Wow.
So Tolkien actually lost both
How
of his
old was
parents.
he when his parents died?
So that was 1904. So he would have been
12?
Yeah, so he would have been 12. So he lost his dad when he was 4, his mom when he was 12. So he was well acquainted with loss at this point.
That's rough.
And they were kind of given over to a father of the Catholic Church, which was Father Francis Morgan. And so he kind of became their caretaker. But here's, at this point already, though, Ronald had already basically mastered Latin and Greek.
Yeah.
He was already very strong in Gothic and Finnish. And so he was truly gifted linguistically. And he was already, it said at this point, he was inspired by some of the passing trains in Birmingham and all the locations and the names written on the sides of them.
Yeah.
And he was already at this point making up his own languages. Like he already understood all the basic building blocks of language structure enough to form, he was already beginning to form his own languages, which to me is just fascinating.
Yeah.
I feel like I don't even understand English
Yeah.
well enough, let alone Greek
that's
and
incredible.
Hebrew. So
The Tolkien Society records that in the autumn term of 1907, Tolkien probably was beginning to invent his own private language, Nafarin, or the Nafarin, which is based off of sort of Spanish and Latin there. So he was a prodigy, as it were, somebody just naturally gifted in linguistics.
absolutely.
Even as a young kid.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, in his own time, he was far less recognized academically for his writings as he was for his linguistic ability.
Yeah.
Like that was
Really?
what he was really his claim in academia, at least claim to fame was just a gifted linguist. And so, his writings were kind of like this other thing, but in academia, that's not what he was recognized for at all.
Kidding.
So,
Wow.
yeah, just kind of interesting. But so basically, so Ronald met Edith when he was 16. She was 19, and their friendship developed and grew. But Father Francis forbid Ronald from seeing or talking to her until he was 21.
Yeah.
He said, "Nope, we're
She
not
was a
doing it."
Protestant too.
Yeah,
which
that's
is
right.
sort of interesting inversion there.
Right.
Like,
And so, but he honored that. He honored that as the authority above him, and he stuck to it to a T. And then later on, he went to Exeter College in Oxford, and that's when he kind of rekindled that relationship with Edith. That was in 1913. So,
yeah, something that's interesting about that moment too in history. So, obviously, their love for each other was developed when they were both sort of in the orphanage together. But the priest forbade it from happening, and they did separate. And Edith moved away. And interestingly enough, during Tolkien's 21st birthday, he reached out to her, and she was engaged to another man.
I didn't know that.
But she had agreed to meet with him, and eventually Tolkien convinced her to marry him. And so she broke up the engagement,
kidding.
and she married Ronald instead.
Ronald went with Ronald.
Good choice.
Good choice. I'd say not too bad of a choice. And then they were married for the entirety of their lives until their death.
Wow. Okay.
So their relationship continued to grow. This is before they were married. But as you guys know, the ugliness of war broke out in 1914. That was World War I. And we see that the war played a big role in not just Tolkien, but also Lewis's life. And really everyone of that time. This was obviously a huge deal being in Britain. So unlike many of his friends, though, Ronald didn't immediately join the war, but he actually returned to Oxford and finished a degree, which he finished in 1915. So many of his friends actually immediately enlisted. And so he took a little longer and finished what he was working on. Then he did join the war, though, as a second lieutenant in the
No kidding.
Lancashire Fusiliers, and married Edith in 1916 before shipping out.
So that was the exact rank of C.S. Lewis too when he joined.
When
he
he
was
joined,
a second
yeah.
lieutenant.
Okay,
Yep.
okay.
He was commissioned.
That's awesome. So this was also a dark time, though, for not just because of war, but Ronald, he contracted trench fever, which many in World War I did. It was kind of like a form of typhoid, and it was horrible. It was nasty. And so he had formerly been so he had many clubs throughout his life that he was a part of, but during the war, all but one of his close friends was killed in action.
No kidding.
All of them but one was killed in action. And so not only did he lose his mother, his father, but he lost actually all of his close friends except for one. And that was so death and tragedy definitely played a role in the formation of Tolkien. And so I think considering that, it's amazing. Only through a biblical worldview do we see, I think, did it become possible for him to have such themes of triumph and victory in his works, because really his life was marked by a lot of tragedy.
Loss after loss.
Loss after loss. Exactly.
Man.
And so not a rose-colored lens at all for life. But so they went on. Ronald and Edith had a son, John, in 1917. And then when the armistice was signed in 1918, Ronald began looking for academic employment. So he wanted to, enter the world of academia. And he held a few different positions, but one of his first big positions was an associate professor of English language at the University of Leeds. And this is where a lot of good things happened. But for one, this cracks me up. We all know of some of the clubs that Tolkien and especially Lewis were involved in, but one of the lesser known clubs that I think is hilarious, he and E.V. Gordon founded the Viking Club. And what they did is they solely met and read Old Norse sagas and drank ale. That was the Viking Club.
Part of me secretly hopes they had like Viking helmets on and were drinking huge mugs of ale.
Well, I mean, he was already part of the tea club, Barovian Society, the TCBS with his friends. And so he moved on from tea to ale.
Vikings and ale, Well, and I'm like, hey, man, you went through war. I get that. I get it. You went from tea to Vikings. I get it.
That's funny.
But I thought that was interesting. And so during this time, while he was at Leeds, him and his wife had 2 more sons, Michael and Christopher. So then,
how many kids total did he have?
So they would end up with 4 kids, 3 sons, 1 daughter. And in 1925, he accepted a position as professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford. So this was his return to Oxford. This was kind of like when he made it, the made it moment. Like you're a professor at Oxford, you've made it. So, so this is when, during this time, that he founded the famous club, the Inklings. And this club included members such as Neville Coghill, Hugo Dyson, Owen Barfield, Charles Williams, and of course, Clive Staples Lewis, or better known as C.S. Lewis. So, and that's also where they had their last child, Ronald and Edith did. It was their only daughter, Priscilla, and that was in 1929. So,
you were talking a little bit earlier, so we know, we tend to remember Tolkien as the author, right? The one who wrote prolific stories and fantasy, and but he really was an expert in languages, and that his kind of the first beginnings of his professional and academic career was not necessarily in writing fiction. Right. It was in languages.
That's right.
So who did he work for?
So he, one of his positions before becoming a professor is he worked on the Oxford Dictionary, which many of us have still heard of or even used today. And
need to still refer to.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But yeah, that was really his, what he was known for in academia was his gifting in linguistics. Yeah. And that's what his professorships were in. He was lesser known for his writings at the time, actually, as he was for, like you said, kind of being a prodigy of language. And really, again, all these things were formative. And we see that when we think of like, some movies like invent their own little language, but when we see like the Elvish language in Lord of the Rings or some of his other works, these are legitimate, have the building blocks of a full language structure.
That's incredible.
And
I've never
interestingly,
what a nerd.
Yes. Interestingly, Elvish really came more out of his studies of the Finnish language. Very close ties and connections there, but it wasn't his only one. And so he was truly gifted in that, and that was what he was known for.
Yeah, and that and poetry even too as well.
Yep.
He loved writing poetry. He loved listening to poetry, and those really do permeate the kind of the prose of his storytelling, especially in the Lord of the Rings.
Yes,
they sing half of the story in Elvish.
Incredible.
So.
Yeah.
Which is so interesting.
It doesn't sound like foolish garbling.
No,
it sounds
because it's
eloquent.
It's not.
That's because it's
it's
a language with a system and a structure to it.
Yep.
It's so interesting.
Man, that's cool.
Yeah, so that was definitely at the time what he was known for. And then later on, he switched at Oxford to a professor of English language and literature, which is what he retired from in 1959. And then just to put kind of a cap on it, and I know we can revisit certain sections or whatever you guys want to do, but Ronald and Edith moved to, again, I apologize to anyone in Britain listening, to Bournemouth after retirement. Bournemouth. And then in 1971, Edith died, and then J.R.R. Tolkien himself died on September 2nd, 1973. But really, I think the two things I would point out from his life, and again, we can visit other aspects, but I don't want to monopolize the time, but really is that all of his experiences were very formative and show up in some way in his works. And so they definitely had an influence. The story that the work that God did in and through his life was in a large part the product of what he went through. Yep. And then secondly, really one of the biggest drivers, obviously his imagination had a big part in it, but one of the biggest drivers in all his works was his love of language. It truly was. And so that was a big driver of the works to come. So.
So now, sort of in transitioning at Oxford, during his professorship, he would have met another member, of course, of the Inklings.
Yes.
Another famous author.
Yes.
Clyde Staples Lewis.
That's right.
C.S. Lewis.
Staples
Also known
Lewis.
as Jack to his friends.
Yep.
Right?
Jack to his friends.
So Jack and Ronald.
Yes.
Jack and Ronald. Yeah. Many adventures.
I'd like to think I would have known him as Jack.
I'm sure.
Sorry to take your point there. And
no, that's great. Actually,
that was well done there, Nathan. Of course, Tolkien. There were so many stories and incidences and things that he's done and accomplished, and we had to pass over a lot of it for the sake of time.
Yes.
So this is very summary based, and so we've covered Tolkien. Now let's go ahead, and I'm realizing I'm calling him both Tolkien and Tolkien.
You're doing it too.
I'm being inconsistent because I'm conflicted now, but
I like to think the J.R.R. Tolkien Foundation is wrong and that it's Tolkien.
Yeah. I'd like to just stand against the society,
Just
Tolkien Society.
There we go.
The Tolkien Society with the truth. Anyway.
So yes, Clive Staples Lewis. Clive. I can't say I've ever met anyone else named Clive or known, but he was actually 6 years the younger of his friend J.R.R. Tolkien.
Okay.
And so he was born in November 29th, 1898 to Albert James Lewis and Flora August Lewis in Ireland.
The Shire.
Bringing back the Shire.
So he borrowed from Tolkien's world he would make in the future.
So he actually had an older brother named Warren Lewis. And so at the age of 9, his mother was on the doorstep of death, basically with cancer. And so Lewis made it a point that he was praying fervently for her to be healed. Yeah. And unfortunately, before Lewis turned to the age of 10, his mother passed away. And it was really difficult for him because she was very affectionate and loving and joyful. Mm-hmm. And his father was tended to, at least some of the history books tell the story that he was a bit emotional and was prone to bouts of depression. And he was a lawyer, and so he was very well off. But after their death, he ended up sending his sons off to a school in England. And so Lewis, at that point, when his mother passed away, he ended up blaming God for her death. And so we kind of see that actually having a big impact on his earlier years, where he was at. And so with that, when his mother died, his father ended up sending him and his brother off to a school in England, which proved to be a horrible experience for Lewis. And basically, a big reason for that was his headmaster was a brutal man. And you say, well, that was the time that they lived in where the schoolmasters were strict. Well, this wasn't necessarily that case. And I was trying to find a little more details concerning that, but it said he was a brutal teacher who ended up being declared insane. And so you see the early stages of that and what that might have entailed. I don't know. I wasn't able to tell, but it was a tough thing for him. So he was, Lewis and his brother were eventually shuffled from school to school until they arrived at a preparatory school, which was the Cherbourg.
The Sherbert?
Yeah, I am butchering this name.
The Sherberg.
Bourg. I don't know how you pronounce that. Cherbourg
Sherbo. Yeah. Maybe.
House, maybe in 1911. And it says that while he was at the Sherbo House, Lewis lost his childhood faith and slowly glided into apostasy. And at the age of 14, he declared himself a full atheist.
Yes, but not out loud. It
Not
was more
out loud.
internally.
It was an internal.
Yeah, there's actually an interesting story about that too. So his father would have taken him, at least there was one story where he took him to a service where they were taking communion. And of course, Lewis, at his young age, he saw it wiser not to reveal his newfound agnosticism to his father. And so he took communion later on, actually, knowing full well that he was not a believer.
Yeah.
And he said that it was one of his greatest blasphemies as he reflected later on after he became a Christian.
Wow.
And then he got to
Okay.
actually take his first communion as a believer. It was one of his greatest blasphemies, being a devout atheist and taking communion.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Man. Well, and he would later on declare himself to be a materialist, which is, he's quoted as saying, "Nothing ever has existed or ever will exist except this meaningless play of atoms in space and time, that our own consciousness is an accidental result of the whole meaningless process and therefore itself meaningless."
Yeah.
And so it says in some books that at that point he pursued worldly passions because it was in line with his worldview. That everything is meaningless. So eat and drink, for tomorrow we die.
Yeah.
That is actually such a good summation of a materialist worldview. Is it's all meaningless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it has such an appeal too, though, especially sort of in the Enlightenment period where we sort of have this belief now as a general society that we can understand the world purely through observation, through the scientific method, that we don't need God in order to understand our world. And that would have permeated the thinking, especially of academics. And for the doubting Lewis now, and then therefore the agnostic Lewis, and for him being just a brilliant and smart individual himself, highly gifted intellectually, it was a perfect fit for him in order just to slide right into sort of the Enlightenment thinking and explain his way, or sort of explain his life apart from God. And so when you have no moral framework in order to live and abide by, then you just engage in the lusts of the flesh. And
It's the
he even
natural
reflects a little bit
course.
about that in his book too, Surprised by Joy, being anti-moral, having no framework through which to act or be moral at all, engaging in the lusts of his flesh, etc. So
That's good. Yeah. And so from 1911 to 1970, or 1917, not 1970, Lewis continued to study at various colleges and universities, and he received actually some great instruction from some gifted tutors and teachers. And so his father, being a lawyer, was well off, and so he really got him some prime education in that. And so I thought there's a funny piece of news, though, that one of his instructors wrote to his father concerning his son and how he was doing. And he wrote this. He said, C.S. Lewis could aspire to a career as a writer or a scholar, but that he had little chance of succeeding at anything else. So
there you go.
And sure
No
enough,
other choices.
yeah, it was a
was,
great career path for him.
He was typecast.
Yeah, he was horrible.
Would
at
not have
math
made a good
and
rugby
the other-
player.
Yes, yep. And so I thought that was kind of funny. So he also studied multiple languages. He did Greek, Latin, German, French, and Italian. So he was very knowledgeable when it came to languages.
absolutely.
Not at the level J.R.R. Tolkien was, but
No, but he needed that skill in order to, I think, read the classics in the original languages. And so he was very familiar with the lore of the past and sort of found a place in being an academic, understanding and having a philosophized opinion about the works of the past, the classics. And those classics really would have been the formations of his worldview, some of the lore, the fantasies of the past. And he had a category for those things. A major theme in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, is the presence of joy as it appears when he's a child, but then it fleets, but then it flees. And in some of these stories and some of these lores about, the hero and the villain, there would be these instances of joy, but to him seemed artificial. I think it's just the image of God in him, like recognizing the stories that God is telling and loving them. But then he reports that in the moment that he would almost realize it, the joy would be gone. And so joy was really a non-present reality, but the thing he was always seeking for.
Yep. Man, that's good. Well, and so during that time, he studied a lot of English and American literature and a lot of literary works. And so that kind of, he was building a base for learning how to write well. And so with that, it was cut short though. And just as you mentioned, Pete, the onset of the Great War, which was World War I, in 1917, at the age of 19, he was commissioned, just like J.R.R. Tolkien, as a second lieutenant, but he was in the Somerset Light Infantry and moved to the front lines of France. So with that, that was a brutal time in history where you got to visually see death and destruction up front. And so that actually had a huge impact on him. And it actually, it was something that he took into account when he addressed later the problem of pain, which is a Christian apologetic that says, how can a good and all-powerful God allow evil, pain, and suffering? And so you see kind of these building blocks of God using these cases in their lives where he would use it mightily to encourage other believers.
Absolutely.
So he just got trench fever as well. So was sent off.
They all did. I feel
It sounds like that's a common thing. And he ended up going back, getting better, and then he was wounded. And but in that, him and I think his units did a heroic act where they ended up capturing, I think, around 60 Germans or something. And so he was involved firsthand in the fighting.
Something that's interesting too. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you there. The themes of war are absolutely something that permeates the fiction of both of these authors as well. And so imagine the insight that they could have into actual warfare that they interweave in their stories. And so that's another prevalent theme as well.
I'm glad you brought that out because we'll see
we'll talk about some of those things in there. Yeah, fiction. So
he was wounded and then sent to England in a hospital, and then the war ended. They had the armistice there. So in 1919, he returned to his life in academia. He studied, wrote, and taught at the prestigious universities of Oxford and Cambridge, and he worked there for the next 44 years of his life until his death. And so it was in that time that I think that's where he had run-ins with J.R.R. Tolkien. Is that correct?
Yeah, this time in Oxford.
Okay, so in that period in 1920, Lewis held an atheistic material view, but he said that slowly changed as he started to study philosophy. And he made an interesting comment. It said, Lewis wrote that he was, in regards to being an atheist, after studying philosophy, he wrote, he was living in a world of contradictions. I maintained that God did not exist. I was also angry with God for not existing. I was equally angry with him for creating a world. And so you see a little bit glimpses into the past where you see his mother's death playing a role in his chosen worldview. So in 1920, he did some studying, and then he concluded that he could not reasonably remain an atheist. And so he became more of an idealist at that point. And he made a funny statement where Berkeley was a philosopher, and he said, Berkeley swept away the foundations of materialism in about half an hour. And for a week or so, I was an idealist. And so it was that time. And I think that it went on maybe about 6 years or so that he remained an idealist. He was open to the idea that there could be a God.
So kind of like an agnostic position.
Yes, an agnostic.
Practical agnostic. I think the thing that's interesting about that period of time in Lewis's story, he's been refuted on a multitude of occasions. And actually, I think on an intellectual basis too, he was being challenged as an academic to try to understand his chosen worldview in light of the realities of his image of godness. And there's a little bit of a collision there. He's being challenged to consider and think about the outcomes of atheism. If ultimately this world is just time and chance acting upon matter, and that there's really no ultimates or oughts. And one of the arguments that really convinced him, that challenged him, was if you believe in atheism, then ultimately your thoughts are just the results of the environment playing on you, and there's no reason for you to trust them.
Absolutely.
And that was a compelling argument for him initially, that he had no way to reconcile that according to his atheism.
Yeah.
And even then, as he reflected back on some of his books, even they began to refute him. The literature that he grew up with and really found solace in began to betray him, because they would have assumed Christian worldview and Christian assumptions. And then so he became, and something he clarifies in his book, he says this did not make him a Christian. This made him, like you said, a theist. And he didn't refer to God as God. He referred to God as spirit.
A spirit. Yep.
And he talks about how that was just a sense of his pride. Like he couldn't hand over the title God to God.
Well, and it's interesting you mentioned that, because it was in 1929 that Lewis confessed on his knees at Magdalen that God is God. But that's not at the point at which he became a Christian.
That's right. He just intellectually
said yes.
He surrendered.
God is God.
Yeah.
So I thought that was
interesting.
interesting, because 2 years later, and it's in this time that God is using multiple people inside the university sphere to really speak into the life of C.S. Lewis.
And it's a lot of Christians.
Yeah. And you see people like J.R.R. Tolkien, who is a linguist.
Yeah.
And he's not a pastor or preacher, but God is using him to impact the life of C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
Something he records. This is from his own. This is from Surprised by Joy. This is. I just find this sort of silly and funny. Lewis records during the time of his just being a theist. He says, as soon as I became a theist, I started attending my parish church on Sundays and my college chapel on weekdays, not because I believed in Christianity, nor because I thought the difference between it and simple theism a small one, but because I thought one ought to fly one's flag by the unmistakable overt sign. So he's like, well, now that I'm a theist, well, where's the closest gathering of sort of theist people?
By default.
I guess I got to fly my flag with them. And so, but he records hating it. Like he didn't love going to church. It was not his forte as a theist. Which why would it be? Yeah, but I find that that's comical.
Well, it was 2 years later from that statement, God is God, to where Lewis actually embraced Christianity. And he wrote about it. He said, Lewis and his brothers started out on a motorcycle to visit a zoo 30 miles east of Oxford. Yeah. He later said that when they started out, he did not believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. But when they reached the zoo, he did.
Amen.
And so you just see the transforming work of the gospel in his heart, where he was a believer.
Yes,
he came to salvation, saving faith in Jesus Christ, and so I thought, I thought that was cool, and I'll probably in there with a small facts that it was from there that he started to do many of his works, a lot of apologetic works from studies that he had studied earlier, and he found great biblical arguments for addressing those hard questions. And actually, his first apologetic work was the problem of pain.
Yes.
And so having an answer for why a good and all-powerful God would allow pain.
Which we see in Tolkien that a lot of his experiences were formative for his works. Yeah. And why would that be Lewis's first work? Well, that was the thing that turned him away from God in the first place, was seeing his mother suffer and die.
It's as if he's writing about his own refutation.
Yes, and so I think that's a beautiful, we talk about God being the greatest storyteller, and I just think even the story of their lives is just good storytelling on God's behalf. Like, it's amazing. You know? You see the thing that drove him away, and now when he comes back to God, the first thing
He writes about his
the
problem of pain.
Exactly. And I think that's beautiful.
Yeah. So in recording the incident of his own conversion, right, the zoo incident, as we will refer to it, this is what he had to say about that. So when he reached the zoo, he did, quote, "Yet I had not exactly spent the journey in thought, nor in great emotion. Emotional is perhaps the last word we can apply to some of the most important events. It was more like when a man, after long sleep, still lying motionless in bed, becomes aware that he is now awake." And I find that quote so
That's awesome.
provocative. So and again, just in reflecting here, Lewis was won to theism on an intellectual basis, but it was some of his friends that would have convinced him, at least in part, that I think God played a role in Christ, who is Jesus, and the deity of Christ, because that's no easy thing to swallow. Lewis would have maybe intellectually succumbed to the idea that Jesus would have been a great teacher, sort of a religious teacher, right?
Yeah.
But his friends, his Christian friends, easily refuted such assertions, right? Somebody who makes the claims that Jesus did is neither a good teacher. If he is not God, then he is a lunatic. As far as some of the claims that Jesus had made about himself, about who he was, either that or he's just foolish. He is no good teacher. He's insane.
Lord, liar, or lunatic.
There's no middle ground there.
it.
And so within the conversations that he would have had with men like Tolkien and some of the other Christian friends that he talks about in the book, that all these queer folk were popping up everywhere, all these Christians in Oxford. And his conversations with them challenged him. And so eventually he couldn't, just sort of fall back on the assertion that Jesus was just a good teacher like the likes of other religious teachers in the past, that Jesus was distinctly different and unique from them.
That was never left an option.
That's right.
And then during this ride to a zoo, he somehow just was awakened to it. And so I just find that so
cool.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's great. How did it end?
He died in 1969.
Okay.
There's a story in there too about him marrying late to a woman named Joy, but her name was H. And she, when he married her, she had cancer. And so he knew that death was coming.
Yeah.
And it was delayed longer than they thought originally. But when she passed away, that was very difficult.
Yeah.
And he revisits the topic of pain when in A Grief Observed. And so he addresses it from more of kind of an intellectual point on the problem of pain to where a very personal addressing at grief observed. And so it's interesting to see the two, but the conclusion still remains the same, that God is good and God is all powerful and God is in control.
Amen.
No, that's good.
So I don't know. I love looking at the backgrounds of these two prolific authors.
Yeah. Similar in a lot of ways and different in a lot of ways
different
too.
And similar. And it's just cool to see how you see the hand of God at work in their lives, even in the dark times.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Bringing out an outcome, God telling a story through these sort of micro storytellers.
Yes.
And how ultimately the works themselves and what Lewis was able to contribute, especially in the realms of fiction, nonfiction, his work on his theological writings, they were a great help have been a great help to the church in the last 100 years. So, so I'm super grateful for him. I don't know. Yeah. But no, obviously, like both of these men, massive. It's just hilarious to me that these two massive members of, history as it relates to literature became friends at Oxford and one another, and
that God used them in each other's lives, and I think we'll see more of that as the works goes on. But one thing that stuck out to me is I want to encourage you all that God is writing a story through your own life, and we also have the greatest opportunity to participate in His story of redemption, and we're all these little stories in the big story, the biggest story. And so, but also I would just point to, because I know that one of the things that comes up when we talk about Tolkien or Lewis is, well, I disagree with their exact position on this or that, or maybe the way they story told or use of allegory or different things. And I know like we can be a little bit critical in the body of Christ. And so, you know, our goal is not to get into all the little nuance and what, you know, we agree or disagree with, but I encourage you to just really appreciate the story, that in their lives and in their works reflect the greatest storyteller of all. And there's great beauty and inspiration in that, I think.
No, that's really good. I'm sorry, man. I'm just cracking up. You know, you just implored us not to, you know, that we should not capitalize on the criticalness of disagreement, right? There's a famous, though, Tolkien sort of famously hated Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia series.
Yep.
But during their meetings, like the Inkling meetings, when they would come and pitch story ideas and stuff, he did not like the Chronicles of Narnia.
No, that's true. And the other interesting thing is, so this is kind of funny, but so Tolkien converted from being a Protestant into Catholicism, and Lewis later converted into Protestantism, and that was also like a source of tension in their friendship, and they did remain good friends. And interestingly, and maybe we'll talk about this more next week in the works, which I'm excited for, but funny enough, like a lot of times we would think like the Protestant, like we have it right, we're better on theology, you know what I mean? And again, it looked a little different back then, but
sure.
And the Catholics, like they don't have theology down as well. Well, one of Tolkien's biggest complaints about the Narnia series was, I think they leave the door open to heresy. You know?
Really? I didn't know that.
It was so interesting. That's funny. Because of his use of allegory and stuff. And so I find it so interesting. But it's also awesome to see how God
he later clarified through his theological works.
Yes. So definitely that's to be taken with a grain of salt, but it is funny to see some of that. So
nice. Well, I've really enjoyed this kind of looking into their lives. This is a great idea, P. And so
good old Jack and Ron.
Jack and
legends.
Ron. That's
Jack
right.
and Ron.
Ronald.
So join us again in 2 weeks so we can jump into the next segment of this incredible story, and where we look into their writings and just get some of the details from there and see some of the allegorical pictures that they intended in those writings. So until then, join us in 2 weeks. We love you guys, and you'll be in our prayers.
God bless.
Good night. Send us a message at feedback@shadowcastradio.com.
Follow us on Facebook and Instagram.
Check us out at shadowcastradio.com.